In the spring of 1963, a French Air Force officer named Jean-Marie Bastien-Thierry stood blindfolded against a wall at Fort d'Ivry, just outside Paris, and was cut down by a firing squad. His crime was leading an ambush that had sprayed a presidential motorcade with machine gun fire, trying to murder Charles de Gaulle. He failed. De Gaulle drove on, calm and untouched, dusting glass from his shoulders. That the men who shared his rage did not give up. They simply concluded that amateurs and patriots could never finish the job. What they needed was a professional, a man with no politics, no country, and no face anyone would remember. That single chilling idea is the engine of Frederick Forsyth's The Day of the Jackal, a novel that turned a failed conspiracy into one of the most influential thrillers ever written, and a book whose shadow fell across real assassins, real fraudsters, and real changes in the law. To understand why the novel grips so hard, you have to understand the war behind it. By the early 1960s, France was tearing itself apart over Algeria. De Gaulle had returned to power partly on the promise of keeping Algeria French, then stunned his most loyal supporters by granting it independence. To a faction of soldiers and colonists, this was the ultimate betrayal, a stab in the back from the one man they had trusted. Out of that fury rose the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, a paramilitary network of bitter officers who launched a campaign of bombings, robberies, and assassination attempts. Forsyth, a former Reuters and BBC correspondent who had reported from Paris and watched the drama up close, knew the world intimately. He did not have to invent the hatred. It was real, and it was recent, and that authenticity is what gives the book its cold, documentary heartbeat. Here's the detail that makes the whole story extraordinary as a feat of craft. Every reader who picked up the book in 1971 already knew that Charles de Gaulle had not been assassinated. He had died of natural causes the year before, an old man in his own home. The outcome was not in doubt, and yet Forsyth manages to make you sweat anyway. He does it by shifting your attention away from whether the Jackal will succeed and onto how the hunt unfolds, the tradecraft, the near misses, the agonizing inches by which catastrophe is avoided. It is one of the great magic tricks in popular fiction, suspense built on a foregone conclusion. You know the ending, and you still cannot put it down. The book is told in 3 movements, and Forsyth even labels them with a kind of clinical honesty. The first is an anatomy of the plot. The leaders of the secret army, hunted and broke, gather in hiding and make their decision to hire an outsider. They summon a quiet, elegant Englishman, and across a hotel table he names his price, $500,000, $500,000, in an era when that was an almost unthinkable fortune. To raise it, the conspirators send their men out to rob banks across France. The killer demands one thing above all: total secrecy. Only the 3 men at the top will know the plan exists, and not even they will know his name. He gives them only a code name: Jackal, the Jackal. The second movement is an anatomy of the manhunt, and this is where the novel's central conflict truly ignites. The French authorities get their first thread of the plot almost by accident, when a thuggish bodyguard for the secret army is lured to France and broken under interrogation. Dying, he gives up a single word, Jackal, and the warning that something enormous is being prepared. A secret cabinet committee is convened in the dead of night, and they hand the impossible task to the one man they trust to do quiet, relentless work: Commissaire Claude Lebel, the best detective in France. Lebel is the book's quiet miracle. He is not a glamorous action hero. He is a tired, rumpled, polite policeman with an ulcer and a domineering wife, a man who solves crimes by patience and paperwork and a refusal to give up. He is handed nothing, no name, no face, no nationality, just the word Jackal, and told to find a ghost before that ghost kills the president. What follows is a duel between 2 kinds of brilliance. The Jackal is meticulous, ruthless, and almost inhumanly disciplined. He commissions a special rifle from a discreet gunsmith, a weapon that breaks down into slim tubes that can be hidden inside the frame of an aluminium crutch. He hunts down a forger for false papers, then murders the man when he tries blackmail. He assembles a wardrobe of stolen and invented identities, slipping from one nationality to another like a man changing coats. Against all this stands Lebel, working the phones, calling in favors from police forces across Europe, building a picture of his enemy one cold fact at a time. Forsyth cuts back and forth between predator and pursuer, and the tension comes from a simple, awful arithmetic. Every clever move the Jackal makes buys him time, and every patient deduction Lebel makes closes the gap. And the gap keeps almost closing, then springing open again because there is a traitor in the room. One of the officials on the secret committee is a vain, foolish man whose mistress is feeding the Jackal's progress straight back to the secret army. Every time Lebel identifies one of the killer's false names and blows it, the warning reaches the Jackal in time for him to shed that skin and become someone new. This is the cruelest twist of the conflict. Lebel is not just racing a brilliant assassin. He is racing a leak inside his own government, and he does not even know it is there. The reader does, which makes every scene at that committee table an exercise in held breath. The Jackal's road to Paris is paved with bodies. He seduces a lonely aristocrat, the Baroness de la Chalonnière, in a country chateau, and when she recognizes him from the manhunt that is finally reaching the public, he kills her without hesitation. He kills again to take another man's identity. Forsyth never sentimentalizes him and never lets you forget what he is. The Jackal feels nothing. He is a machine pointed at a target, and the horror of the book is partly the horror of watching pure competence with no conscience attached to it. The third movement is the anatomy of the kill, and it builds to one of the most famous climaxes in thriller history. De Gaulle is to appear in public on the 25th of August, Liberation Day, the anniversary of the freeing of Paris from the Nazis. He will pin medals on the chests of old resistance fighters in the open air. The Jackal, disguised as a war veteran with one leg, his rifle hidden in his crutch, takes a window above the square. He sights the president. He fires. And in the very instant, the trigger breaks. De Gaulle bends forward to plant the traditional kiss on the cheek of an old soldier, and the bullet passes through the space where his skull had been a heartbeat earlier. The single most disciplined assassin imaginable is undone by a courtly French custom and a fraction of a second. Before the Jackal can chamber a second round, Lebel, who has finally run him to ground, bursts in. The Jackal kills the policeman at Lebel's side, but Lebel snatches up the dead man's submachine gun and cuts the Jackal down where he stands. Then comes the ending that sealed the book's legend. The Jackal is buried in an unmarked grave in a Paris cemetery, attended by almost no one, his coffin lowered as an unknown. Throughout the hunt, Lebel had clung to a single deduction about who the man might really be. An Englishman named Charles Calthrop, partly because the French word Jackal could be teased out of the killer's name, the first letters of Charles and Calthrop folding into the codename. It was elegant. It was logical. And on the final page, Charles Calthrop strolls back into his own London flat, alive and bewildered, having been on a quiet holiday the whole time. The man in the grave was someone else entirely. The book closes on a question nobody can answer. If the Jackal was not Calthrop, then who in God's name was he? The greatest assassin of the age vanishes into history without a name. That refusal to explain him is what makes him unforgettable. The story behind the writing is almost as good as the story itself. Forsyth wrote the novel in roughly 35 days, flat broke after covering the war in Biafra, with little expectation it would sell. He wrote it the way a journalist files a report. Lean, factual, almost cold, and that style was a revolution. He more or less invented the modern documentary thriller, the kind that buries you in convincing procedure until fiction feels like leaked intelligence. The manuscript was reportedly turned away before a publisher took the gamble, and that gamble paid off beyond anyone's imagination. When it appeared, it won the Edgar Award for Best Novel from the Mystery Writers of America, and became a runaway bestseller, and it has never been out of print since. It also rewrote the rulebook for the genre, and you can trace its fingerprints across decades of thrillers that came after it, every one of them trying to make readers believe they were holding a secret file rather than a story. But the real notoriety, the reason the book matters beyond its pages, is what happened next in the real world. The Jackal's method of obtaining a false passport, by taking the birth certificate of a child who had died young and was about his own age, was so plausible that real criminals and intelligence operatives began using it. The technique became known, literally, as the Day of the Jackal fraud. and it forced governments, including Britain's, to overhaul the way they cross-checked birth and death records to slam the loophole shut. A novel had revealed a real weakness in the machinery of the state. And the codename itself escaped into reality too. When the infamous terrorist Ilich Ramirez Sanchez was being tracked, a copy of Forsyth's book turned up among belongings linked to him, and the press christened him Carlos the Jackal. The nickname stuck for the rest of his life, fusing a fictional killer with a real one in the public imagination. The book's grip on culture only tightened through its adaptations. The 1973 film, directed by Fred Zinnemann with Edward Fox as a chillingly cool jackal, is still regarded as one of the finest screen thrillers ever made, faithful to the novel's clinical tension. A 1997 Hollywood version starring Bruce Willis took little but the title and was largely disowned by purists. And in 2024, the story was reborn as a glossy television series with Eddie Redmayne, proof that more than half a century on, audiences still cannot resist the duel between the faceless killer and the dogged man trying to stop him. So why does it endure? Because at its core, The Day of the Jackal is not really about whether one old general lives or dies. It is about two opposite kinds of human excellence colliding. The cold genius of a man who has erased himself to become a perfect weapon, and the humble, exhausting persistence of an ordinary man who simply will not stop. One of them is glamorous and monstrous. The other is unremarkable and quietly heroic. Forsyth makes you admire the assassin's brilliance, and then makes you grateful it is beaten by something far less flashy. That is the secret behind the notoriety. The Jackal terrifies us because he could be anyone, and reassures us because, in the end, he was caught not by a hero, but by a tired policeman who did his homework. More than 50 years later, we are still watching that window, still holding our breath, still waiting for a shot we know we'll miss.